Could a budget deal be near? At least there are rumblings. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. With me today to talk about the ongoing negotiations at the State House, which we're, gosh, it's been a long time since there's been a state budget, hasn't there? Charlie Wheeler is back, director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield, and before that, a longtime State House reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times. Welcome back, Charlie.
Thank you, Bernie. I always enjoy being here.
And Dave Dahl is here. He is State House reporter and morning news anchor, WTAX in Springfield.
Hello, Bernie.
Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you.
So, budget deal or not? Where are we with this? There's talk of negotiators who are talking, some on the record, some off, about perhaps $5.4 billion in new revenue, maybe borrowing $5 billion, more than $2 billion in cuts. How real is this as we tape this show? Dave?
Well, Thursday, a group of reporters, including yours truly, talked to State Representative Fred Crespo on the floor, and he is part of the working group talking about the budget. And his attitude to me appeared to be, don't believe everything you read and don't get excited about everything that you read. And this comes off of a report early Thursday on Politico by Natasha and Capital Facts by Rich Miller, Rich having the numbers, Natasha not.
Natasha Karecki, formerly
Correct.
of the Sun-Times.
I can barely pronounce Natasha. So, nevertheless, Representative Crespo said, don't get too excited about it. They're just numbers. If they're true, they're just numbers, and they didn't come from me. But we've passed them up for the leaders to look at. All we did is put down numbers that balance out. It doesn't mean that we're really any closer to anything. And so he basically towed that line for a few minutes. And so based on that, I'm not sure how excited we can be about what we've been hearing. We've gone without a state budget for almost a year. Do I hear 2, 3, 4? So, as usual, color me cynical.
Charlie, you've never been cynical in your reporting career. No, just kidding.
Well,
how's it looking?
I guess on the one hand, I agree with Dave that it's still not soup. But on the other hand, when you consider where we are in the fiscal year, the fact that people are even talking is probably a good sign. And I suspect were it left up to rank and file lawmakers, this would have been settled a long time ago. The difficulty is you have two people at the top locked in sort of a titanic power struggle. Governor Rauner, who is insistent that he won't deal on a budget until and unless he gets some of the items on his so-called turnaround agenda. And Democrats are equally adamant, particularly House Speaker Michael Madigan, that we want to do a budget without all what Madigan would consider this extraneous stuff that in the long run will hurt middle-income workers, namely changes that Rauner wants in collective bargaining. So as I say, most of the rank-and-file people who hear from the providers, the state workers, the human service folks, the school people in their districts about all the pain and suffering that is being caused by this long-standing impasse, these lawmakers want to get something done, but it will require some mode of cooperation between the governor and the legislative leaders, Senate President John Cullerton and Speaker Madigan.
Let me interject, Charlie. You say that the governor wants elements of his turnaround agenda, but I'm not sure we can even nail him down on which elements would represent something that he wants.
Yeah, well, I will say that, he had a few appearances in Springfield during the week, one of them, or Springfield area, one of them was at New Berlin Elementary School and then junior, senior high. He talked about things that he wants. He still wants term limits, even though the deadline passed for legislators to put it on the ballot in November without a vote. But he says, well, they could vote for it and put it on in 2018. That would do. He is for remap reform, redistricting, which there's been a statewide referendum filed. We can talk about that in a minute because now there's been a lawsuit filed against that, but there are like 570,000 people signed petitions to get that on the ballot. He wants that. He talked about local property tax freeze, but stressed that just a freeze isn't enough because that won't help local governments with their costs. We have to let them control their costs. What he means when he says that, and when he elaborates, and he even said this, he wants them to have flexibility on collective bargaining, so allowing local governments not to collectively bargain on many issues with their employees, and he wants flexibility on prevailing wage so they don't have to pay prevailing wage. These are the collective bargaining and prevailing wage are the kind of union-oriented issues that someone like Speaker Madigan and other Democrats, prominent and not, say we're not going to make those changes in Illinois because we're a strong Democratic state. We still have a strong union base. Of course, the unions support the Democrats. The Democrats are supporting the unions. They say it's supporting the middle class. Rauner says this is adding to government cost. Then you have Speaker Madigan, who appeared in an interview this past week on Channel 20 WICS in Springfield, saying, I'm not going to let the governor erode middle-class wages or send injured workers to the emergency room and to welfare, which is what he means by workers' compensation changes, which is another one of the turnaround points the governor wants. So while the negotiators, again, as Charlie said, the rank and file are coming up with the budget agreement, the governor is still saying, I've got to have some of these things. And he sounds serious about them, like we're not just going to throw more money at it because then they'll blame the Democrats for raising taxes. And Madigan saying, we're not going to erode what we've given in Illinois to the middle class. It isn't the role of government to reduce wages for people. And that's where we're at.
Yeah, I'm not sure the goalpost is real clear that the governor has set. And the line that you quote from the speaker, he's been saying for the entire session. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so we're there. One of...
But see, it strikes me, though, that there's room for compromise on this stuff.
Like workers' comp, perhaps?
Yeah, changing some of the rules on workers' compensation to ease the costs on business. For example, figuring out a way to allocate responsibility for an injured worker so that some of the damage caused in these repetitive motion injuries, for example, can be allocated to a prior employer, or maybe more importantly, figuring out a way to make sure that the insurance companies pass on the savings from lowered costs for compensation. The Governor's Commission on Workers' Compensation released a report, I guess it was a year ago now, saying that the costs have gone down close to 20%. The employer is saying, we're not seeing that in our premiums. And so maybe that's an area where you can look at the insurance industry and say, are you passing on the savings to the employment
And that's
community?
Democrats have been saying that because they made some changes a few years ago.
That's an area. You could look at prevailing wage and say, okay, we're not going to do away with it, but maybe on small projects below a certain level, we won't have to pay prevailing wage. But on major projects, we'll keep it. So this stuff doesn't have to be all or nothing. There's ways around it, and if people are willing, and if they have good intentions, I think you can work something out. I'm not sure that there's a lot of good intentions here floating around.
They could get a budget done if they wanted. They could get anything, well, a lot of things they get done if they wanted, but I think you've nailed it. I don't think they really want those things. I think
we'll see. I think they all, want things to go smoothly, but they want things to go there. Everybody's got to have what they have to have. I will say I talked to Greg Bays. There was a conference of a couple of business groups, including Illinois Manufacturers Association. Mm-hmm. He's the head of that. And he was saying that his members, and as you might expect, are mostly with the governor on these things. And he said, and changes in workers' comp, he said to me, wouldn't necessarily send people to the emergency room, but if a knee replacement cost a certain amount in Illinois, and it's he thought it was like significantly more, 30% or something, then it costs what the workers' comp system has to pay. Then I think he said Indiana. That wouldn't. It's just a difference in level of things. So I don't know where it goes because clearly everybody has interests in the system.
But that's the kind of thing where there's room with the details, and you can reach some agreement. You mentioned I was a reporter for the Sun-Times, and I was for 24 years. And in all those years, there were differences between the business community and organized labor on stuff like workers' compensation, unemployment insurance. Typically what would happen would be representatives of both camps would sit down, they'd hash out some agreement. Neither side would be totally satisfied, but everybody could live with it. They'd present it to the General Assembly as what was called an agreed bill, and the legislature would sort of rubber stamp what the business community organized labor had agreed to, the governor would sign it, and we'd move forward.
Right, but everybody has to kind of get along for that to happen. Although they did do a little something on, I think it was unemployment insurance this year that was similar to that.
Yeah, and it was based on agreement between business and labor. They both got something they wanted.
Right.
General Assembly ratified it, governor signed it.
The Manufacturers and Retail Merchants Conference, I find it interesting, it's the first year I can remember, that neither the governor nor any of the legislative leaders have been there. That's been an annual stop for a long time for both the Speaker and the President of the Senate, and sometimes the Governor.
Well, they did bring in a speaker from the Cook Political Report. I think her name is Amy Walter, and she was an excellent speaker, so for what it's worth. And
So
right
maybe
down
that
the
was
middle.
better.
And right down the middle. But yeah, it was perhaps a different thing. There's been talk of a $700 million human services bridge kind of bailout, or using some money in existing pots that are there for human services, some from other things. I will say that the governor, when he appeared at a child development center at Lincoln Land Community College, was asked about that, and he says, "I'm really looking for the bigger bargain. This bridge idea, I'm not really high on." I said as he started to leave, he did actually answer the question, though. Does that mean you'd veto it? He said, "Well, I would. I'm just not going to say that, but I'm in favor of a grand bargain." So I don't know where that goes, except that many interests are saying if there is money available and we can pay social services money that we've owed them for the last year, some of them have closed, but some are struggling and hanging on, let's pay it. Any thoughts?
Well, it occurs to me that the legislation actually was up for a vote on Thursday in Illinois House. It passed 111 to 3 present, with nobody voting no. And the House Minority Leader, Jim Durkin, was one of the 3, and 2 other Republicans who voted present. Now, if the governor were still adamantly opposed to it and thought it wasn't a good idea, my guess is that it would not have been a 111 to 0
because
roll
the
call.
members were allowed to do
The
this.
governor's office raised questions about some of the wording in the appropriation. To kind of simplify it, there's the final paragraph of this multi-page bill says none of this money can be spent for operational purposes. They say it in more elegant language, but that's basically it. The governor's office is raising the question, some of these human services require spending for operational purposes. They pointed out, for example, the Lincoln Challenge, which is a program for young people to help them get back on track. And they say the bill appropriates money for it, but this final paragraph says it can't be used for operational stuff, and that would include buying food. Or there's a helpline for senior citizens, and operational costs would include paying the phone company for the lines that the calls are made on. And so with this limitation, this bill won't really achieve what people want. And the funding comes from, the largest portion of it comes from a piece of the income tax that, since the tax hike back in 2011, has been sliced off and put into a special fund to be used for human services. And the reason for that is there was, I guess, kind of the prescience on behalf of the people who drafted that legislation 5 years ago, that if in fact the income tax rates roll back, human services and education might be hurting for money, and so we set up 2 separate funds, one for education, one for human services, that get money kind of skimmed off the top, and that money's been sitting there without an appropriation. So this bill would tap that pot and tap some other special funds that would be used mostly for human service purposes anyway. And the argument is, the money's sitting there, let's use it for what it's intended.
Yeah, well, just as a reminder, and most people who watch this probably know, the end of May is when the legislature tries to get all of its business done, and when they don't need an extraordinary majority to do it, just majority votes to pass appropriations bills, regular bills, for the fiscal year that starts July 1. The governor even mentioned the other day is hopeful something will happen at the last minute like it always used to those past years, but we'll see. There's been a lot of talk about school funding. And Andy Manar, who's a state senator from Bunker Hill in Macoupin County, has been working for a few years on redoing the formula to try to make it the way the state spends education dollars more equitable. He wants the formula to change to particularly help districts with poor kids or kids that need extra help. That, however, would send some more money to Chicago. the governor and other Republicans say it's a bailout for Chicago. Manar says if you do just what the governor wants, which is throw like another $55 million into the pot, give it to who you got. The rich, in some cases, get richer, and the poor, in some cases, get poorer. Where are we going with this? Because the Senate did pass the Manar's bill, but questionable if it'll pass the House.
Well, excuse me, again, I'll look back on history. The last time we had a major revision to the school aid formula was in 1997. And viewers might recall, older viewers anyway, that at that time Governor Edgar had proposed an income tax increase with $900 million to roll back property taxes, the bulk of which go to schools
The old
anyway.
swap.
It was the swap.
Right,
And
lower property
million,
taxes, higher income taxes.
$600 million for the poor school districts. The House passed it. The Senate sat on it, and it didn't go anywhere. In the spring, they came back in the fall, and they cobbled together another plan, which is our current school aid formula. But to make it work, they put extra money into the pot. They changed the way riverboat casinos are taxed. They put a new tax on telephone service. They did some other things to generate enough money so that no school district would lose out under the new terms. And for, I don't know, half a dozen years, there was money set aside so that if under this new formula you're going to get less than you did in the base year, 1996-97, we'll make up the difference. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem, in my mind, with Manar's plan. Manar's plan would more equitably distribute the money, but because there's no more money, equitably means people who are now maybe getting more than what some would consider their fair share are going to have to give some of that up, so people who are getting less can have it.
Well, except that Manar does say he wants to hold harmless, which means in the first year.
In the first year,
but then it would.
In the second year,
over 4 years, it would go down to those levels you're talking about, and
yeah.
so everybody, the opponents are saying we lose money anyway because we don't even like the superintendent at the New Berlin district was saying, I don't even trust that money will be there to fill the gap. Dave, this is seems like a real regional issue. Chicago, downstate, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it does, and it doesn't play to our best selves, does it? But I think if you're a superintendent, you don't know if your school's going to have the money to open on time. You don't know how much money you're going to get. And I rather doubt that bill's going to be called in the House, and if it does, it may not pass. Senator Manar only got 30 of his Senate Democrats to get on board the bill, plus one Republican, Senator McCann.
Yeah. One interesting, just historical point, at many stops along the way, and Governor Rauner has been going to lots of schools, including New Berlin, and he often uses the line, well, the current formula, the Democrats put this in 2003, and they didn't do anything with it when they had all the power, so now they're complaining. But Charlie, you were mentioning 1997 when I guess the Senate was Republican, the House was Democratic under Mike Madigan, and the governor was Jim Edgar, a Republican. But in 2003, there was some tweak to how they figured, I believe, and this is when Democrats were in control, how they figured the poverty grant or that part of the formula. But is it fair for the governor to say 2003 the Democrats made this formula?
No. I think he's flirting with the truth, and he's bending it. Maybe it's not an outright lie, because that tweak was passed by a Democratic-controlled General Assembly, signed by a Democratic governor. But what the tweak was, it redefined what counts as poverty, and it was something that was pretty well agreed to. Under the 97 version, poverty was as defined by the federal census. So in the year 2000, the census counted how many low-income kids there were in a particular school district. They provided the numbers that the school district were able to say. By 2005, those numbers were out of date. And by the next census, they could be really out of date. Supposing you have a community, particularly downstate, where there's a major factory operating in the census year. So everything's fine. 2 years later, the factory shuts down. The jobs are sent to Mexico. Suddenly, unemployment goes up. The poverty levels rise, but you're still locked into that decennial census. So the change was to count kids who are eligible for welfare programs, who are on TANF, temporary assistance to needy families, who qualify for the kid care, health insurance, who get reduced meals. So it's more an up-to-date current measurement of poverty.
But the basic formula stayed the same as it was in 97?
And the basic formula stayed the same. It was a definition of what counts as poverty. One big change occurred a couple years before, and it was signed into law by Governor Ryan, and it was sought by Republicans in the suburbs. It was a change in how a local government's tax base is considered for the formula purposes. In kind of oversimplified terms, the more local wealth you have, the less state aid you're allowed. And the suburban lawmakers complained that because of the housing bubble, their values were going up. But because of tax caps, they couldn't actually tax that property base. So the formula considered you have all this wealth, tax cap says you can't access it. So they put in legislation that changed the formula to allow the districts to only count as their local wealth that portion which they could get to under tax caps.
Okay.
And it was sought by Republicans. The Senate Minority Leader, Christine Radogno, was one of the sponsors, and George Ryan signed the bill.
Who
That
was a
major
Republican
change.
and would still
so
claim to be. Okay, very interesting. Okay. We mentioned earlier in the show this redistricting idea. And Dave, I don't know if you were at the State Board of Elections when the truck came in. Well, I wasn't able to make it, but it's been a week. I guess the 570,000 petition signatures were delivered by truckload. But now there's a lawsuit that is questioning the constitutionality of that, which is what happened the last time this was tried on a statewide basis. The signatures were questioned, and then the constitutionality was questioned. Now, I know one of the lawyers in the challenge that was filed in Cook County Circuit Court is the chief lawyer for the Democratic Party of Illinois. We know Speaker Madigan has said he doesn't like this plan, even though some prominent Democrats are in favor of it. So I guess the question is, well, a court will decide now if voters can vote on this in November. And do we think it would pass? Because the governor says he doesn't look at polls, but on an issue like this, he says people who are polled like this, because this is one of his pet things, redistricting reform. So any prognostication?
Do we think it'll pass when it gets to the ballot, or do we think it'll pass the court challenge?
Well, if it gets to the ballot, I'm assuming that people would think it would go, although I guess that's not even certain, because there are some people who argue that it hurts minority communities, and it depends how much advertising is done.
I would bet that it would pass if it were put before the public.
In this atmosphere of we don't like the politicians, this would be certainly something that seems to work against the status quo.
There's certainly going to need to be an advertising campaign to educate people about what it's about and how they should vote, which means there will probably be 2 advertising campaigns, if indeed it survives the court challenge.
And I think we can look at precedent. The one that was attempted a couple years ago, the Circuit Court of Cook County threw it out, saying that it exceeded the very, very narrow limitations that the Constitution allows for citizens' initiatives, for amendments. And the court back then said, well, one of the provisions of your proposed constitutional change would say that someone who serves on this newly created commission that's going to draw the maps can't run for a statewide elected office for 10 years. And the judge said that imposes an additional condition for eligibility.
Not allowed.
And that exceeds the constitutional revision article.
Right, because you can't do that by petition, because we're not California. You can't just do Proposition 37 and ask for any law. It has to be about structure and function of the legislature.
Thank the Lord.
Right. Yes.
So
that
now,
would make
the argument that's being made that struck me, a couple of points are, one, you assign new duties to the Auditor General. The Auditor General is in the finance article, not the constitutional revision article. And you also assign new duties to the Supreme Court.
Right, and that is exactly what this petition to the court says, that those things are beyond the scope of
They're beyond this very, very narrow scope.
So we'll see what happens. There was a meeting in Springfield this past week of many delegates who are going to the Democratic National Convention. Mike Madigan, who in addition to being Speaker of the House is Chairman of the Democratic Party, was there. They, I think, took some formal action to fill some of their delegate slots for those who weren't elected at the congressional district level in the primary. And one of the things that, and we have more, Illinois has more Hillary Clinton delegates than Bernie Sanders, but it's a mix. In fact, it's not a giant difference, but Hillary did win Illinois, Secretary Clinton. And one of the things that Mike Madigan said was he gave a little speech and he just warned the delegates, don't think that just because Donald Trump is the Republican nominee that this is going to be easy. So what do we think about that? What effect will the Trump campaign have on Illinois, perhaps in legislative races, Dave? Any thoughts?
Well, as we all know, Illinois is not exactly a red state, particularly when it comes to the presidential election years. I think the Trump phenomenon is one where he's bringing people in who maybe haven't voted before or haven't paid attention to politics, and that's a bit of a wild card. But I think the statement that you attribute to Speaker Madigan, Chairman Madigan, is that he's awfully cautious, as he was in his own primary campaign against Jason Gonzalez.
Right, yeah. There was a lot of funding from somewhere for an opponent, and Mike Madigan had lots of signs and lots of campaigning just to make sure he was reelected, renominated in his own district. One of the other things, just something that happened over within the last, I guess, 10 days, the governor said that if the budget gets solved, that one place he would love to go is Poland. Of course, Chicago has one of the largest Polish communities in the world outside of Poland itself, or a city, and try to drum up business there because America has no better friend than Poland. How do we think he'll get there in the next year, Charlie? He did say he would go on his own dime, as he's always said, that he wouldn't charge the state for this travel.
I would advise him maybe not to book his flight quite yet. If it's contingent upon getting this all wrapped up by May 31st.
Okay, well, we won't watch for it then, but we are out of time. Charlie Wheeler, Dave Dahl, thanks for your thoughts. Thank you for watching. I'm Bernie Schoenburg, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.